Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and sending each and every one of you so much love. I do hope you're doing exceedingly well and keeping lovely warm in those very cold winter conditions out there. So make sure you get that lovely hot cup of cocoa because you're going to need it. And I've got a lovely story for you tonight that you're really going to love. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up. And let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, I'm going to pretend that my name is Max for the purposes of my story, because I live in a small community here in Mariposa, which is the southernmost of the Mother Lode counties and has a long, indelible gold mining history behind her. In those former bygone days, the intrepid pioneers travelled from all parts of the world with the covetous, aspiring dream of striking it big and getting rich. Generations later, people are still coming to Mariposa to pan for gold. Our county is in close proximity to national forests, parks on the Merced River, and the charming idiosyncratic town itself is quaint, endearing, and rather old-fashioned, with loads of really good places to eat and lodgings to occupy. Much of our income in this part of the world is procured and sustained from the tourism industry, which is indeed flourishing here. I grew up in Mariposa with both my parents and a younger sister. We live about 25 minutes outside the old world town and make an income by letting out a few charming avant-garde wooden cabins, which my father ingeniously built from scratch, because he's a carpenter of note. Sometimes he even restores furniture for people, and he can transform something from the scrapyard that looks like it's due for the dumpster into a work of unconventional art, which is why our cabins are all fitted with charming eclectic pieces of my father's revolutionary work that is admired by all of our visitors. I love living in this part of the world, as I'm one of those people with an inquiring, investigative mind that is always listening and asking so many questions. I've met people from all over the world here, from Sweden, Europe, Germany and England, and the list goes on, including of course North Americans from other states who are visiting Yosemite National Park for the very first time. And believe me, people are absolutely blown away by the national park and the mesmerising sequoia groves with trees that possess the most imposing tree trunks that you have ever observed in your entire life. I even had a long-distance relationship with a Swedish girl who was renting out one of our cabins. The relationship lasted for over a year, and I would visit her and her very close family in Sweden. When I was back in North America, our relationship continued online, so to speak. It would seem that she was not prepared to leave Sweden, nor I America, so we had quite literally reached stalemate on the chessboard of our lives. In the end, I knew it couldn't work out, with the great distances involved, and so I automatically called it quits, and have never regretted my decision. And I'm currently dating a local girl, and things are moving along very nicely for the both of us, I'm happy to say. You see, I couldn't envisage leaving North America and living outside Mariposa. I just adore being in close access to so many amazing outdoor opportunities, as this way of life for an intrepid explorer like myself simply just cannot be rivalled. I love everything here, from hunting, fishing, skiing, rock climbing, camping and snowshoeing. Over the years, my family has visited Yosemite National Park on multiple occasions, which from Mariposa is a scenic drive on Highway 140 to the park's west entrance, where you can enjoy and marvel the exquisite mountainous views over the river canyon. As a family, we've camped, hiked and explored in this incredible park over the years, and never was one trip ever quite the same as another, as every experience we've had there has been so unique. Yosemite was designated as a World Heritage Site in 1984 and is revered and esteemed for its illustrious granite cliffs, monoliths, deep verdant valleys, crystal waterfalls, clear sparkling streams, ancient sequoia groves, silvery lakes, mountains, meadows and glaciers, and about 95% of the park is actually designated wilderness. Springs here are beautiful to behold because as the glistening white snow slowly melts, the rivers begin to roar, and as the streams begin to rise, the waters cascade off the cliffs in powerful jets of thunderous white spray. Then the redwood and the dogwoods begin to blossom, bloom and flower, and the plants across the valley start sprouting their leaves. May approaches soon, and spring flowers undulate in the breeze, their delicate blooms colouring the valley with splashes of pretty pastel colours. In the summer the weather is warm to hot, with the occasional afternoon thunder showers, especially on the higher elevations. The beautiful exquisite wild flowers fade, and the thunderous jets of water that cascade from the waterfalls become less fierce. In the summers you will appreciate the expansive blue firmament that frames the masterful rocky outcrops and mountainous valleys that are all flanked by the alpine rich trees in varying shades of green, that are offset by the pristine sparkling streams of crystal clear water. It is during the heart of summer, when vacationers flock to the park in their thousands. I tend to avoid the park during the busier times of the year, as I prefer to have personalised solo adventures when the park is undisturbed, quiet and still, without a solitary soul in sight. The best time of the year to visit the park for me personally is always the winter. Yosemite could be forgiven for being a whole nother world when the winter arrives. Thick white snow literally blankets the valley in clouds of glistening white carpets, powdering the alpine trees in silvery webs, draping the pine needles in garlands of glassy crystals or pearly tinsel. It would seem that with the wave of a magic wand, this infernitude of wilderness has magically transformed itself into a winter wonderland that will quite literally take your breath away, as the beauty and tranquillity of this calming, quiet oasis becomes almost surreal. Can anything really be this sublime? It would seem that it can. I have visited Yosemite over many years for my solo snowshoeing adventures, and this is where my strange, rather extraordinary story begins. It was on the December of 2016 that I spontaneously at the very last minute decided to go on another solo snowshoeing adventure, because I enjoy the peace and quiet solitude of Yosemite, as it's a chance to be one with the natural world and to empty my mind completely and just enjoy the experience. The rest of my family was going Christmas shopping, but I had firmly decided I would leave all that boring stuff before Christmas Day, as I avoided the shops like the plague. I'm possibly the worst Christmas shopper in the world, and there are times I'm ashamed to admit that I've resorted to giving people vouchers, as nothing is more exciting for me than embracing the snowy weather out there. I have often found driving on some of those Yosemite treacherous roads in winter conditions to be hazardous and precarious. I often need chains on my wheels. Even four-wheel drives may actually be instructed to use chains if the conditions are potentially dangerous. But the good news is that they can be hired and actually bought in Mariposa, and you can also phone a special number for an updated weather report, which will give you special indications of what the weather is like on the roads, which sometimes I do just to be safe, and I do find the service rather invaluable. So there I was in my absolute element, feeling on top of the world as I began snowshoeing in the park, which is a habitual winter pastime for me as a regular to Yosemite. I've always enjoyed this invigorating exercise. I tend to find snowshoeing to be an energising sport, and these days I'm pretty accomplished at it as well. I'm also a skilled, rather proficient skier. I do believe having a great sense of balance helps enormously, and in my youth I was an aspiring gymnast, so flexibility and agility are some of my stronger points. On this particular winter's day, a gentle cold breeze was blowing against my face, the burning cold sensation seemingly invigorating my mind and body with boundless energy and exuberance. I had been snowshoeing for a couple of hours, and after a while I sat on the highest peak of a hilly elevation and took off my satchel, where I removed a flask and drank a hot cup of coffee. I sat back and soaked in the nectar-rich beauty of the sumptuous wilderness swathed in white. I lapped up the view like a hungry sponge and wallowed in it like a hippo in a pool of water. Such was my pleasure in this moment of time. It was an exquisite day, and there is nothing like drinking hot coffee to energise the mind. I began to survey the whole landscape with my binoculars, examining the whole area intently. Then I saw it. It looked as if the end of the ridge that I was well acquainted with was jutting out rather too far forward on the lower elevation, which looked rather odd to me and very much out of place. I have what I can only describe as an excellent visual and photographic memory, and I tend to recall sizes, shapes and edges with extreme accuracy, which is a peculiar gift of mine. I knew that something was exceedingly different about that ridge, but what it was I couldn't imagine. If I wasn't a regular visitor to the park, I would almost certainly have overlooked this and have not given this revelation much of a second thought. It was then that I decided to investigate that ridge further, which required a lot of downhill, very steep and treacherous snowshoeing to an area where the ground dipped to a lower secluded valley, which the less adventurous would find a little too challenging to undertake. I ventured ever closer towards the ridge. I could feel that despite being exceptionally fit, that this was far more arduous and taxing physically than I'd ever envisaged, and I was beginning to chastise myself for being so reckless. Never mind, I told myself, you're almost there, you can do it. Let me assure you, this was far from easy. As I reached the flattened dip near to the edge of the ridge, I saw what it was that was seemingly out of place. The only way I can describe it to you was that this was like an igloo structure, which was more square in its shape and was so cleverly designed that even if you were looking at it straight on, you may not have noticed it at all. Indeed, you would have perceived it to be an intrinsic part of the ridge, as layers of the fallen snow swayed the surface seamlessly, blending it into the snowy drifts, making it appear virtually invisible to the naked eye. Yet I knew whatever it was, it shouldn't have been there. This structure had been built to look like part of the ridge. I observed the timbers and branches weaved together meticulously and layered on top of each other methodically and pressed down with thick snow, and it had been masterfully done, and there was a small opening at the far end. I knew at once that this was some kind of a den, and so I did my level best to be as quiet as I possibly could, which is no easy feat, let me assure you. Whether I was mad to investigate this peculiarity, given the perilous risk of being fast food for a potential predator lying there in wait, I am the first to concede my inquisitive impulsiveness could be my greatest undoing. After all, don't they say that curiosity killed the cat? Although my instincts were ringing in my ears like loud clanging church bells telling me to leave at once, it would seem that I was subjected to an internal struggle, as the meddling, impertinent, snoopy schoolboy within me chose to rebel against my own inherent advice. It was then that I peered into the igloo-like structure, and I was not prepared for what I was unravelling. The only way I can describe it to you is it looked like 5 colossal critters, the size of grizzlies, were all snuggled cosily together in a huge heap for warmth, and they were snoring like humans, only with a much more guttural, deep and shorter snort. I peered in very slowly and just eyeballed the scene in utter and total astonishment. I couldn't believe what I was observing. What were they, I wondered? There was no way they were bears. But what could they be? As crazy as this sounds, in that moment I never even perceived, not even for a second, that these sleeping colossal lumps of dark straggly hair could actually be Bigfoots. I turned away from the igloo for a moment, and that was when I discovered a dead bighorn sheep that was covered in snow lying outside the den, and parts of it had been eaten, as there was a couple of legs and a rib missing from the critter. Once again I tottered over to the igloo-like structure, as I was just so incredibly fascinated and enthralled, and my audacious curiosity was insatiable and unquenchable. I stared into the opening once again, keeping incredibly still. In a trice, one of the critters started twitching his nose, as if he was smelling something, and that something must have been me. I was horrified as this gargantuan heifer lump started to move, and in the sea of dark brown, messy, bedraggled long hair, I observed these big yellow eyes, opening very, very slowly. All of a sudden, my blue eyes were locked into a stare with this critter's deep-set yellow eyes, and for a second all was very still and silent, as we held each other's gaze. Somewhat startled, the critter raised up his torso from his sleeping position, and that was when I realised I was looking at a Bigfoot. I was bedazzled and amazed, and my eyes widened in astonishment as my jaw dropped to the ground. I think the critter was as astounded to see me, as indeed I was to see him, because he rubbed his eyes for a second, as if he believed he was having a bad dream. He just stared at me with a bemused, baffled look on his leathery grey face, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The critter sat upright all of a sudden, with the straightest back that I've ever seen, and his seated torso appeared to be over 5 feet off the ground, and he was 3 foot wide, but the size of his shoulders were literally titanic, and his beefy arms were built with dense muscle. I noticed the head was monstrously huge, and it was shaped like a pyramid with a little point at the top, and it just flowed seamlessly into the shoulders with no visible neck to speak of. The critter had a very long angular face with a prominent extensive wrinkled brow ridge, very flat nose and long thin mouth. It just contemplated me for a long moment with its deep-set golden eyes, as though he was in a hallucinatory dream world, I think. I believe I had woken and disturbed him out of a deep sleep, and he seemed somewhat dazed, befogged and confused. I can't say I blame him. The huge comatose lumps around him wiggled a little because he had moved, but they remained deep in sleep and unfazed. At first, I can honestly say, curiosity outweighed my fear for a moment, but then, as common sense prevailed, it was like I suddenly became blindingly aware of just how vulnerable I was. There were 5 of these critters and only 1 of me. I could potentially be next on their dinner menu, and those thoughts got the hair on the back of my end standing on edge. I quickly moved away, dropping the contents of my rucksack on the ground in my desperate need to escape as hurriedly as I could. But I did not care. I left everything there apart from my binoculars and my car keys, and quickly tottered up the hilly elevation as fast as I possibly could. Even though it was freezing cold, hot sweat was literally pouring down my face in beads of perspiration, and my heart was pounding so fast that I could actually hear the drum rolls. I was breathing heavily like someone very unfit and out of shape, which was far from the truth. I looked back towards the ridge, but to my astonishment I did not see anything or anyone chasing after me. And when finally I made it back halfway to the top of the hill, I scanned the area very briefly with my binoculars just to check that I wasn't being pursued. I could see that the critter who I'd woken up was now wide awake and standing outside the igloo structure, and I could see he was giant in height. I could detect that he was foraging excitedly through my rucksack with about as much gusto and enthusiasm as a kid rifling through their Christmas stocking. It did not seem he was intent on chasing after me at all, which I found astonishing. The critter was playing with my flashlight, switching it on and off, with a look of delight on his face. He was also opening my raisin and white chocolate cookies and eating them hungrily. I think he was enjoying them because I'm almost certain he was smacking his lips. I tried to remember what I actually had in my rucksack. Oh yes, there was a flask of coffee, a bunch of grapes, an apple, some peanuts and jerky, a bottle of Mountain Dew and a cold meat pie. I knew that the critter was in for a great feast, and by the look on his face he was not intent on sharing any of my goodies with any of the others. I looked through the binoculars and the critter stood up and actually nodded in my direction. I must have imagined that, I thought. Surely to God, no. That hadn't just happened, had it? How could he possibly know that I was viewing at him through my binoculars, I wondered in awe. I lifted my arm and waved excitedly to the critter and made my way to the top of the hill, and exhausted and overwhelmed by what I'd seen, I trekked speedily back to the car, my legs aching and throbbing from the exercise. I could hardly dare to believe that a creature emerging from the pages of fiction had simply walked into my reality. From that moment my cynical mind became enlightened, and I knew that my view of the world had forever been changed. In December the following year, I looked for that same nest against the ridge, but it wasn't there anymore, and I remember being bitterly disappointed, and despite my very best efforts, I could not perceive nor detect another nest in the area. Fast forward to 2018, and it was in early spring that a very big, hefty German man called Jürgen Schmidt was visiting Yosemite Park, who was staying at one of our cabins, and was parking my car when I saw him. I happened to notice this man wandering around the place in a daze and seemingly in a trance-like state. He looked like a person who'd been shocked out of his skin and was bewildered and disorientated. I brought him to my house because he was shaking so much, and his eyes seemed to have glazed over. I gave him some brandy and he gulped down 4 shots gratefully, and I asked him what on earth was wrong and why he appeared to be so distressed. He told me that he'd seen a monster that was half man and half ape in the Yosemite National Park. As he was telling me this, he was physically shaking, and I could tell that even the memory of the creature was traumatizing him. At first I thought I was imagining things, he told me. I thought it was part of a tree moving because it kept swaying backwards and forwards against the tree line. looking rather like a dark, shadowy silhouette. I focused my binoculars on the tree, and then I realised this massive tree was actually a colossal creature that was thick and tall and covered in hair, with long arms and a cone-shaped head. It seemed to look straight at me from that long distance. It was like he was looking through me, and it gave me the chills, but I couldn't look away from it. Its eyes appeared to hypnotise me, and after that my memory goes blank, and I remember nothing at all. I found my face being slapped hard by a tourist who kept telling me to wake up, wake up, wake up. And she explained that I looked like I was about to jump off a high rocky elevation into the stream, and that I looked as if I was in some kind of a trance. I've no memory of even walking up that ridge. I can't understand what happened to me. I really think I was out of it. Jurgen looked at me solemnly. I don't expect you to believe me that I saw a creature like that, but unless my eyes deceive me, I'm sure that that is what I saw, but I have no comprehension of what it could have been. I believe you, I told him, and he looked up at me in surprise and said, You do? Yes, I told him. I've seen one myself, but I did not have the harrowing experience that you had, but I have indeed locked eyes with the critter before. I believe you actually saw a Bigfoot. Bigfoot, said Jurgen. What on earth is that? You can learn all about the critter online, I assured him. Many refuse to believe that he's real because they can't envisage a critter like this existing here. But for those of us who have seen him, we know he's real. So there you are. That's my story. Ah, what an incredible story. You make me want to go to Yosemite National Park right now. Until next time, goodbye and good night.